Good afternoon, and welcome to the Bureaucratic Resistance to Autocratic Ambitions panel, hosted by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, the University of Chicago Center on Democracy, and the Democracy Fund. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. At the Center for Effective Government, we bring together scholars and practitioners to host robust discussion and generate ideas about how we can strengthen democratic institutions and create a more effective government. This panel, the first of two, will take stock of the conditions of the federal bureaucracy in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. We'll also look at the norms, rules, and practices that guard against populist attacks on the administrative state. You'll have the opportunity today to hear our panelists speak about the various aspects of bureaucratic resistance, and we'll save about 30 minutes for audience questions. Please feel free to use our Zoom Q&A function if you have a question for our scholars. If you enjoy the conversation today, I encourage you to attend our follow-up event in the fall, which will be a continuation of this discussion. I also invite you to join us for another event next week with Protect Democracy on the history, impact, and the future of the filibuster. We'll drop a link in the chat. Finally, I'm thrilled to turn things over to our moderator, the Director of the Center for Effective Government, Professor William Howell. In addition to Will's role as CEG's director, he is a Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, with appointments at the Harris School, the College, and the Political Science Department, where he serves as chair. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a host of Not Another Politics podcast. Will is an expert on separation of powers and American political institutions. He has written 8 books. The most recent, with Professor Terry Moe at Stanford, is titled Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. Will, you are our guide throughout today's discussion, so thank you so much.
Well, I don't know about a guide, but I'm going to give it a shot. I am thrilled to be here. I've really been looking forward to this. And thank you, Sadia, for bringing us together and for all that you do for our center. We are here to think about bureaucratic politics, and we're building off of a long literature, frankly, that recognizes the bureaucracy as a site of real political contestation. And it's a site of contestation in which political superiors in various ways try to redirect the doings of bureaucrats. Sometimes by scaling back their activities, other times by trying to enlarge it, sometimes by redirecting it from kind of one objective to another. And I, in thinking about this panel, I dusted off and I spent this morning reading Richard Nathan's The Plot That Failed, came out almost 50 years ago, right? Thinking about what Richard Nixon was doing in trying to reshape the federal bureaucracy. So look, these politics aren't entirely new, but I think there's a sense that things shifted in important ways with the Trump presidency and the unleashing of populism within our domestic politics. And one way to think about that, how I'm inclined to think about that, is that what populism does is not just try to redirect in large scale back those kinds of politics, but tries to delegitimate, tries to undermine, tries to corrupt or marginalize the development of expertise, the effective operations of bureaucratic behavior. And there was a lot at a high level, a lot of concerns raised while Trump was in office that these kinds of things were going on. And that as a result, in a general way, the federal bureaucracy was being hollowed out, was being compromised and marginalized in ways that came at a real cost to the public welfare. Our task today is to think through those politics, not in a very general way, but to think kind of locally about, well, what did that look like within agencies? What did that look like on the ground? From both sides, frankly. On the one side, those who would try to limit or undermine or marginalize or delegitimate goings on within the federal bureaucracy. And then on the other, efforts by various actors, very much including bureaucrats themselves, to offer a kind of resistance, that they don't simply roll over or say, well, give it all up. They offer various kinds of resistance. And so what might that look like? We couldn't have a better panel. Let me introduce to you, the panelists who are going to be speaking before us. We have first Rachel Potter, who is a professor at the University of Virginia's Department of Politics, who's written a great deal on political institutions and regulation, public administration and separation of powers, and her book, Bending the Rules, Procedural Politicking and the Bureaucracy, which the University of Chicago Press published in 2019, Rachel, I think like it won every award there is to win. I mean, it's just a terrific piece of scholarship, and it's had a big impact on our understanding of the politics of rulemaking. We have with us as well David Lewis, who is the Robert Webb Wilson University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science at Vanderbilt. He previously was a professor at Princeton and at College of William and Mary. He has written just a ton on the politics of bureaucracy and issues involving politicization, the effective operations of agencies, the extent to which ideology plays a role in the actions that bureaucrats take. A terrific and award-winning scholar, and I'll say I had the great pleasure of going to graduate school with him. Rudy Mehrbani, who is a senior advisor at the Democracy Fund and a senior fellow at the Brennan Center. He has served as an assistant to President Obama and a director of the Presidential Personnel Office at the White House, where he advised the president, cabinet members, and other senior government officials on human capital issues, who is just an incredibly thoughtful person when it comes to thinking about what an effective federal bureaucracy might look like and what kinds of reforms we need in order to get from here to there. Jennifer New, who is a professor of law here at the University of Chicago. She's just down the block from me. Her research interests involve administrative law, executive branch dynamics, regulatory policy, and constitutional separation of powers. Before coming to the University of Chicago Law School, she serves as a clerk for Judge Richard Posner in the Seventh Circuit, and then to Justice Stephen Breyer at the U.S. Supreme Court. And lastly, we have Walt Shaub, who's a senior ethics fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. He is a government ethics expert who has advocated for integrity and accountability in government across a career in public service. He leads POGO's Government Ethics Initiative, and we're really fortunate to have him joining us today. We're going to go in that order, and so the play here is going to be, we're going to hear from each of our panelists. They're going to speak for roughly 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for general discussion. And I encourage all of you in the audience to post questions. Feel free to post them at any time. We're first going to hear from all the panelists, but we will turn to the questions as best we're able in the Q&A period. So without further ado, let me hand the floor over to you, Rachel, to get us started.
Great, and thanks for hosting this panel, Will, and the center as well. I think this is such an important conversation to have because of our political moment here in the United States, but also across the world where other countries are facing challenges with respect to democratic backsliding, or however you want to describe it. I think the most important issue, if we're going to talk about bureaucratic resistance, is people. Where are people? Where are having the right civil servants and the right political appointees? I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to point out that it's super important, and I hope my co-panelists, or I know they'll cover a lot of that. What I want to talk about is, what does it mean for a bureaucrat to resist, and what does that look like in practice? So I'm going to define it really loosely, as we have a career civil servant who, because of professional and other norms that they've become accustomed to, do not want to implement what a politician is asking them to do. And so how would they do that? How would they go about not implementing something? And I want to just talk about this, give a few examples to put some flesh on the bones that the other panelists can then talk about. I think the most visible thing that we can think about a bureaucrat doing is protesting, right? So we saw this at the beginning of the Trump administration, where bureaucrats at the Environmental Protection Agency were very much opposed to what the actions that Trump was proposing to take with respect to climate policy and a number of other initiatives at the EPA. And they were actually out there in the streets on their lunch break with anti-Trump signs. So we hadn't really seen a lot of that in the US before, but that is a very visible way that we can observe that bureaucrats are resisting what the political leader is asking them to do. Another visible thing we might observe is a bureaucrat might actually exit. They might leave the civil service and as a sort of conscientious objector and say, I'm not doing this anymore. We see a fair bit of this in the data. not just in this administration, but in any administration. We see exit, and Dave has written a fair bit about this. But we also see a lot of op-eds that might come out afterwards. This is why I left. This is what I saw. This is what's wrong with our government or our agency or this political leader. Leaking is another form of bureaucratic resistance. We saw we had a very leaky administration in the Trump years. Seems like the Biden administration is a little bit less leaky. But we see bureaucrats working with reporters to tell us what's happening and sort of gain attention to an issue. Whistleblowing is a similar type of a way a bureaucrat can bring attention. I call attention to these two things, leaking and whistleblowing, because we don't always know that they're happening. We might read a story in the Washington Post and not know where the source is, if they're in an agency or which agency they would be in. So this is, we're kind of going from the most visible type of resistance to going up the scale to we don't actually know how much this happens or when it's always happening. And then a thing I've written a fair bit about is thinking about procedures, right? So if you know anything about bureaucracies, you know that they are just rife with procedures. There's just process everywhere you look. And the way I view that is that this process gives bureaucrats a lot of influence and control because nobody else really understands what all these process steps require and when they're supposed to be done and how they're supposed to be done. But civil servants are the ones who kind of get it, right? They're the experts in that area. And so I think about things like how fast or slow does a particular action move through a process? Is it slow rolled, like taken really slowly? Or is it sped up and sped through the process and becomes a final agency decision really quickly? We often don't know why something is moving fast or slow. We just observe that it is. And a bureaucrat who's the expert might say, it has to go this way. There's information I have that you don't. So control over speed is one type of this, what I call procedural politicking, the control over procedural processes. But there's a ton, and Jennifer has written a lot about this as well. There's a ton of different ways that agencies can do this, and bureaucrats can use their control over procedures to resist what is being asked of them to do. One thing I think is really interesting, and again points to this question of observability, is an example of, again, the EPA during the Trump years, when the agency has many analytical documents that accompany their policy decisions. And sometimes those documents would include numbers that the political officials didn't like, or found out later that they didn't like, but necessarily didn't understand what the implications right away of those numbers were. And there's sort of Easter eggs for environmental interest groups who could later sue the agency. So sort of putting things into policy documents, right? These are not things we always observe. We observe them when the New York Times writes an article about them, but we don't always know how much resistance is happening, when or exactly how. So we observe the really high profile stuff, protest, exit. We don't always observe the type of sort of nuanced things that are happening. And so I just want to close by making 2 points about this. That is, we don't know the extent of resistance that happens under any administration. And so we should always keep that in mind, that we're only observing the things we can see. And the second point is that when we frame bureaucratic resistance in terms of populism, it sounds very attractive, right? We want to all fight against populist tendencies. We should be very aware that there's a flip side of this, right? Which is framed very neatly by Donald Trump when he says there's a deep state, right? Bureaucrats who are unaccountable or make decisions without consulting political leaders or the public preferences. So I just want to highlight that this is not necessarily a pure good or a pure evil. It's something that should be considered in a nuanced fashion, and we should explore those boundaries. So I'll stop there and look forward to my co-panelist comments.
That's terrific, Rachel. Thank you. I'm busy scribbling down notes as I keep looking down. That's what's happening over here. Thanks for getting us started. Dave, could you take the baton?
Yeah, thanks. It's great. I'm like you, Will. I'm excited to hear what people have said, and Rachel is the right person to kick us off. I'm going to talk a little bit about the other side of this, which is the populist strategy for influencing the administrative state. So William and Terry Moe have written a terrific book about presidents and populism. And one of the things that they say in this book is that a populist president, like the previous president, has a part of the playbook is to tear down the institutions that resist the goals of that president as they understand them. And so I think I'll say a little bit about the direct sort of attacks on the administrative state that in cases where they see resistance. And then I want to talk a little bit more in more detail about some more subtle ways that, or unexpected ways that those kinds of strategies affect the behavior and the attitudes of folks that work in the departments and agencies of government. So I would say, if we sort of started from William's sort of playbook, we would say, well, a populist leader says things about the folks that resist them. They call them the deep state, or they call them the swamp, implying, right, either that they are subversive and their intentions are bad, or that they're corrupt or lazy. That goes to then sort of justify attacks on the laws and regulations and norms that govern the administrative state, right? So we flout the Vacancies Act, or we work to change the content or interpretation of regulations around civil service or scientific integrity. But perhaps more perniciously, you see presidents attacking informal norms and institutions, things like, expectations about appropriate levels of expertise, concerns for the appearance of propriety, sort of norms of transparency, the kinds of things that are the tissue that holds together the behavior of the administrative state. And then, of course, there are the direct attacks on capacity, right? Things like budget cuts in agencies like the Labor Department and EPA and state that are sort of dramatic, but also hiring freezes and government shutdowns. So those are things I think if we've been following the news, those are things that are familiar to us. I want to highlight three things just briefly that are a little bit outside that direct attack that are consequential for the kinds of choices that the government employees and executives that Rachel described, what environment they're in. The first thing I want to highlight is just a subtle politicization that can happen in the civil service itself. So, one of the things in the last administration that I think people fail to recognize is that most government employees had no contact with an administration appointee at all. There were long periods of time where there was no one from the administration there to tell them what their vision was for the agency, no one to tell them that they were valued, no one to tell them that they were confident that in their professional, in their norms of professionalism, they could cooperate effectively with the new administration. And one of the things that I think we fail to appreciate, and it probably is becoming clearer now, is that one of the responsibilities of an elected leader is to articulate shared values and to call people to those shared values. And that if you don't do that, you can undercut the very norms of professionalism and identity that make the administrative state what it is. And what I worry about is that when civil servants are told that they're corrupt, that they're inept, that their intentions are bad, or that they're extremely partisan and subversive, you in some ways legitimize or normalize that kind of self-identity in a way that undercuts professional norms. So my fear is that if you call someone Obama partisans, and that's the way they're making decisions in the civil service, they then begin to say, oh, I guess that some of my colleagues are that way. And maybe that's a legitimate way to think about what I do. Or conversely, well, if they're Obama partisans and as a Trump partisan, I'm going to make that more a part of my personal identity. And the professional civil service and the norms and ethos there are strong, but they depend importantly on elected leaders articulating shared values, modeling those values and calling people to those values in order for the civil service to work. And if not, you get this kind of pernicious but subtle politicization of the civil service that can be consequential for the performance later on. The second quick thing I want to say here is that we focus on the direct attacks on particular places, right? The president or a populist leader in another context encounters some resistance, but there's a general disdain for the general management of the administrative state that is sort of happening undergirding the more direct attacks. So for example, and this is something Rudy can speak more authoritatively to than I can, in the first year, President Trump only nominated persons for 39.5% of vacant Senate confirmed positions. The rest didn't even receive a nominee in the first year. 2 years into the Trump administration, 36% of vacant Senate confirmed positions had not received their first nominee. And the consequences for that are large, particularly given the fact that it's not a random sample of positions that are vacant. It's assistant secretaries for management, it's people in CFOs, it's people in charge of IT, the kind of people who are responsible for the long-term care and feeding of the administrative state in ways that are consequential. And you can see when surveying federal executives how much they are concerned about the overall health of their agencies, the workforces, their procurement processes, the ways that they're making decisions, and their ability to even think into the future and plan in an effective way. GAO's high risk list is just getting longer, right? And it's not an accident. It's because of a general neglect and disdain of the administrative state. And the last thing I'll say, and this is also a little bit subtle, is that people don't obey the law because they fear punishment, right? And people don't cooperate with government unless they feel like it's what they should do. People obey the law because they think it's the right thing to do, not because they fear punishment. And so much of what government does relies on the voluntary cooperation of people that they have no direct control over, whether that's clients of public programs, whether it's nonprofits that are responsible for implementation, it's state and local government agencies, or even other agencies inside government. And if we communicate that federal employees have bad intentions, that they're inept or they're corrupt, you decrease the incentive for people to do what we need them to do, to cooperate with the FBI, to give information to the US Attorney's Office, to submit information to the CDC to help respond to a pandemic, to build healthcare exchanges to implement the Affordable Care Act. Those things require voluntary cooperation by people that the government has no control over. And if you undercut that, it really affects the quality of policy implementation. And so when we say, like, what can administrative officials do in response to these kinds of things, those are some of the things that are happening in the ether that we may not be as clear about.
Terrific. I'm filling up my little binder here. This is great. Thank you, Dave. Let's keep it going. Rudy, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks, Will, for including me. And I have to say, just listening, I'm learning so much from Rachel and David, and I really am just honored to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And thank you for putting together such an important conversation. What is abundantly clear to me is that 5 minutes is entirely insufficient for each of us to go into detail on these issues. And given some of the comments that Rachel and David just made, I might actually sort of scrap my prepared remarks here and sort of fly off the cuff to talk a little bit about what I think were some of the checks that existed on the personnel process, and thinking about what President Trump, but also what a future populist or autocratic actor might try to do, particularly as I think about the dangers that lie ahead in 2023, and then even worse in 2025, and whether or not the existing checks are strong enough to withstand a recurrence, given that there has been a playbook of sorts that has now been written for a future populist to follow. So, I mean, when I think about, what does a populist leader want to do when they are in office, and I'll talk from both the experience in researching this outside of government, but more interestingly, I think, to the audience here and to the other panelists, given the experience that they have, is probably my experience within government, and notably in the presidential personnel office. But what do actors want to do? Well, they want to install their political loyalists into the most important positions. These can be described as cronies or friends, and a good question is whether or not there are sufficient institutional checks to ensure that those people are actually qualified to do important roles. And you may be asking, well, the political appointees are intended to be selected based on their partisan preferences of the president. And that's largely true, but there have been some basic standards that I think have developed over the history of our republic that ensures that appointees are generally competent and qualified. Now, there was a time where government largely operated by a spoils system, but I think that there were a series of scandals, going back several decades. The most notable where this starts is the Teapot Dome scandal, I believe, which then leads to the Pendleton Act. And in the future, the Pendleton Act is built off of to put together the Civil Service Reform Act following the Watergate scandal. But since then, there have been pressures on presidents to ensure that appointees are qualified for basic positions. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, like the political ambassador positions. But for the most part, I think that presidents have been forced both by Congress and public pressure to ensure that that there's a minimum threshold that these appointees make. And I think that recent history shows that when presidents are appointing people that are not qualified, that there's some sort of response. Congress, for example, after the Katrina disaster, decided that President Bush's appointee to FEMA, which was in charge of responding to the emergency that was that was Hurricane Katrina, was not sufficiently qualified for that position, and Congress inserted additional qualification requirements into the statute so that future FEMA directors met a minimum qualification requirement. And so I would argue that what we have seen is that right now there is almost nothing stopping a president from appointing their friends, former domestic employees, spouses of domestic employees, as it turns out, to significant positions. And if there isn't enough political will and incentive for Congress to respond and pressure the president to act differently, then you have a scenario where you have unqualified people who are going into positions. Now, David also raises an important point about vacancies, but I'll just sort of table that for the moment, given that we only have a limited amount of time. And the other thing I wanted to raise about the political appointments process that I think is not a topic of sufficient conversation is the role that the background investigation and the ethics review process plays in ensuring that appointees are competent and qualified. Now Walt would be able to speak to the ethics process in more detail, so I'll just talk about the background investigation process for a second. A lot of people believe that the background investigation that is conducted on Senate confirmed nominees is something that's required by law. But that's actually not the case. It's another one of these things when I was a lawyer in government, frankly, that just shocked me that we did because it helped contribute to the vetting process to ensure that the people who we were selecting and putting forward for Senate confirmation were competent, that they had the right sort of mentality and judgment to operate within a complex bureaucracy, and that they could be trusted to do the job well. Now, a benefit of doing the background investigation before nomination was also that you would be able to determine whether there would be any stumbling blocks to those people obtaining security clearances once they were in an agency. But there wasn't a law that required that the president put these nominees up for background investigations. There was an expectation by the chairs and the ranking members of committees that they would be able to review summary reports from those background investigations before moving forward with them. And one of the jobs that I had in President Obama's administration was actually briefing chairs and ranking members on those background investigations. It would just be me and the member staff were not allowed to participate in those briefings. But what we saw during the Trump administration was that if there were political officials that the president believed were would serve his purposes in such a way that he deemed it necessary to skirt those background investigation requirements, or even in some cases overrule career officials when they deemed issues that arose during the background investigation process is too problematic to warrant giving them a security clearance, that there was nothing stopping the president from doing so. And I think that especially if you look at what happened during the confirmation process of Justice Kavanaugh, that there is a real argument to be made that the Senate needs to rethink how they rely upon those background investigations in evaluating a nominee that's put forward for their consideration. I mean, in a lot of ways, the FBI that conducts the background investigation is in a subordinate position to the White House. They go and investigate what the White House asks them to investigate. They operate within some pretty strict parameters that they can't go outside of unless they're requested to do so. And so if you have a White House or a president who's not actually interested in getting to the truth or to the bottom of an allegation, then there's no reason that a Senate that's acting in good faith should rely upon that investigation in determining a nominee's suitability. So I think I've probably gone over my time. A couple of the other things I wanted to talk about but didn't get to touch on were some of the other mechanisms within executive branch agencies, like inspectors general, like rules that protect whistleblowers and prohibited personnel practices, and how those have unfortunately been shown to have weaknesses, that if you are a populist who is looking for workarounds or looking to expose loopholes, there unfortunately are a number of them. And we can bracket those as well. If people have interest in talking about those further, I'd be happy to comment on that. So hopefully that made some sense despite my departing from my prepared notes. And thanks again, Will, for organizing this panel.
That's great. Thank you, Rudy. You took up Rachel's initial charge, which is the people matter a bunch, and ran with it productively to focus on, well, how do we make sure we get decent people into positions of power? Jennifer, let's turn to you.
Thanks, Will. So this is such an important topic, and I appreciate so much the chance to reflect on it with this distinguished panel, and also post-Trump, and as we kind of think forward under the Biden administration. And so some of my comments really pick up on a lot of threads that Rachel introduced, and then I'll allude to the great points that both David and Rudy have raised as well. So Rachel, in her work and in her comments, alluded to various ways in which bureaucrats can resist covertly, right? So in some of her written work and in the book, Procedural Politicking, right, she talks about the different ways that they can write rules and analyses to obfuscate and frame their content in favorable ways or time it in political environments. And that kind of resistance really does happen internally within the agency. Rudy, I hope will get more of a chance to talk about, as he alluded to, all the different ways within the executive branch more broadly, right, whether it's through inspectors general and so on, to resist. And all these different channels that exist to allow whistleblowers to make their dissent known within the executive branch. What I wanted to talk about, which Rachel very much teed up, was a particular kind of resistance that I think was, if not, it wasn't unique, but certainly at its height, I think, in the Trump administration. And that is a form of resistance that I have in the past in some written work called civil servant disobedience, very much a play, of course, on the idea of civil disobedience, but really is exercised by civil servants. And that concept, one formulation of it is that it entails conscientious, public, overt acts of dissent that violate internal agency norms in an attempt to bring about some kind of political reform. Critically, again, it's conscientious, it's public, it's acts of dissent that violate internal norms and directives in an attempt to bring about political reform. So what I'm going to do in my short amount of time is I'm trying to make the claim that, which is empirically hard to show. Okay, so I'm going to have to do it through anecdote, but just try to say that the extent of it was what's really unique about the form of bureaucratic resistance in the Trump administration. I'm going to speculate about why this might have happened more in the Trump administration. To wit, I'm going to argue that this kind of resistance is a form of fire alarm in the face of two conditions: norm breaking on behalf of the president, the autocrat, autocratic inflected potential leader, and then relatedly, threats to the rule of law. Okay, and I think this is very much related to David's points about populism and kind of what that entails. And I think it's the perception, again, of norm breaking happening from on top, and the perception of threats to the rule of law, that I think civil servant disobedience is an example of norm breaking in response to norm breaking, right? That to see publicly these civil servants that when they're operating under such a norm of they're faceless bureaucrats, but they're faceless for a reason, because the norm is not to make yourself known, I think, to the public in general. It's just such a huge thing. And I had some slides, I won't show them, but just to kind of impress upon us just how striking this was. So, and then finally, what I'll do is I'll just reflect on, potentially the likely prevalence of civil servant disobedience in the Biden administration. I'm going to focus in particular on immigration, okay, and the extent to which we'll see it flipped in different agencies. We may or may not see this happen, particularly with ICE, okay, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Okay, so quick, just some anecdotes about the prevalence of civil servant disobedience in the Trump administration. Like Rachel, one of my examples was going to be the specter of the EPA. And I think it was really striking to me because it happened in Chicago. I mean, I'm sure it happened elsewhere, but the picture I would have shown was, in Chicago, these EPA employees out in front of the press in their roles, in their official capacities, protesting the Trump administration. Just strange times. Another example I've got for you is Marcus Smallwood. He was a civil servant, probably still is, a civil servant at HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And he was asked to compile documents related to a congressional request. And this was an investigation, as some of you probably recall, into Ben Carson, the HUD secretary's decorative ambitions, right? Using public funds to get like fancy furniture and fancy dishes and so on. And he wrote this letter, this open letter that said, I do not have confidence that HUD can truthfully provide this evidence because there's been a concerted effort to stop email traffic. And he shared this letter with the Guardian and with the press. I mean, just what a breaking of the norm. And then, of course, famously as well, scientists, as you recall, at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration publicly contradicted Trump's famous claim that Hurricane Dorian threatened Alabama, right? This is Sharpie Gate, right, where he kind of drew the path of the tornado. And two top NOAA civil servants not so quietly revolted against in this unsigned agency press release that was issued to rebuke the Birmingham Weather Office. And I would have shown you a tweet that was like, this is not the path of the hurricane, okay? Very much contradicting what Trump said. Okay, despite my claim that this form of resistance was more prevalent under the Trump administration, lest we think that this only occurs under Republican administrations, I'm going to offer up the example under the Obama administration of 10 ICE officials who openly refused to implement a DHS directive dealing with DAPA, deferred action, of course, for parents of Americans, on the grounds that this DAPA memorandum was illegal. They even went so, not only did they openly refuse, publicly refuse, the head of the ICE union said, we're not going to implement this memorandum, okay? They actually sued the Obama administration, right? Very publicly, that they thought that this was illegal. So to my second point, in light of my speculative thesis, that I think it's more likely to, civil servant disobedience is more likely to occur under, perceptions of threats of the rule of law. I want to use these ICE officials because I want to flip the notion and like kind of jar our sense that this is, only, this only occurs under Trump, to kind of really try to think principally in a principled manner about this practice. And say that I think there really was a credible argument that DAPA was illegal. I do. I think that there's a real argument under the APA that the Administrative Procedure Act, that it really should have been issued through notice and comment. And that is exactly what the Fifth Circuit held when it considered the issue. The Supreme Court, because it was evenly divided, just affirmed the Fifth Circuit because of the tie. But I think that because I think that there's a credible argument, I think there's a way to understand the ICE, what happened with ICE under DAPA, as in support of my thesis that this occurs more when there's a perception that the threat of rule of law. And under Trump, it was just so much more heightened that helps explain why it occurred. Civil servant disobedience occurred much more under the Trump administration. Finally, just to kind of reflect on, will this continue to happen under the Biden administration? So, time will tell. We're still, relatively early in the administration. I think some reasons to think that it will continue less. Okay, is first of all, I will note that the Biden administration, at least with regards to DAPA and DACA, has publicly committed to engage in notice and comment rulemaking. because they felt like they had to, but they also, it does seem to be more in line with the rule of law. And so far, reports of resistance at Department of Homeland Security seem to suggest that the resistance is still covert, right? ICE agents are, some of the claims are that they are slow walking some of the implementation of Biden's executive orders, but these are the kinds of covert and familiar kinds of bureaucratic resistance that has occurred throughout history. And then to David's point, I think another reason why we're less likely to see the Biden administration is because of the restoration of a number of norms that speak to norms of professionalism and management that David alluded to. And I think the Biden administration could go even further to be very transparent about its decision-making processes. I think David was on the mention this, but I think what was striking about the Trump administration was how much the civil servants were cut out of the process. And I think when anybody working in any organization has no idea what's happening in management, I think there's a real sense of delegitimizing kind of what occurs. And I think the more the management is transparent about how they arrive at decisions, the more buy-in there is from employees, and therefore less of an incentive to openly resist. At the end of the day, I'm optimistic that these historic norms that have of professionalism that have prevented civil servant disobedience, or at least tamped down on it. I think these norms are resilient ones, because I would like to see less civil servant disobedience. I don't think it's something to be celebrated. I think it is destructive to the administrative state in ways that we can discuss further, but the jury is certainly still out on the question.
Jennifer, thank you. A lot in play there. So last up is Walt. Let me reiterate that audience members, if you have questions, please feel free to post them. We're going to turn to them shortly, but the floor is yours, Walt.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm going to take a page out of Rudy's book, as I often try to do in life, and scrap what I was going to say and focus more on specifically some of the things that were said. And I think Jennifer's comments tee up perfectly what I wanted to talk about. And I think maybe we partially disagree on this, but I definitely agree with sort of the focus. At the end there, your comment that it's destructive, I think that can be true. I think, though, that it's really important, and this is the thing I wanted to talk about today, is that there are two different types of resistance. There's resistance in the name of policy, and there's resistance in the name of democracy. And resistance in the name of policy is something that I would consider to usually be destructive. And I think Rachel's example of the EPA agents, or an example of ICE agents or CBP agents, though not the one that was just discussed by Jennifer, because I think Jennifer's right that this was about whether it was legal or not. But I think the two agencies, EPA and the parts of DHS focused on immigration, are the offices most likely to have resistance based on policy. And I think that's because the agencies attract personnel who have a particular viewpoint, and therefore are maybe more vulnerable to being tempted in that way. But I think that very distinct from that is resistance in the name of democracy. And that comes really from the set of ethical principles that lies at the heart of the government ethics program. George H.W. Bush first articulated these, and they're now in the Office of Government Ethics regulations that apply across the executive branch. And there's a set of 14 principles that lead off all of the rules that then follow. But the very first principle, sort of the prime directive, if you're a sci-fi fan, is this. Number one says, public service is a public trust requiring employees to place loyalty to the Constitution, the laws, and ethical principles above private gain. Now, private gain isn't necessarily their own gain. It can be the gain of others, and that could include political gain. And I think that gets to the heart of something that David said, where he said that we really should be having leaders call people to a shared set of values. And in fact, that's what George H.W. Bush did with these set of principles that pretty much until Trump, prior presidents of both parties agreed with as well. And that is that you're loyal to the republic, you're loyal to its constitution and its laws and its unwritten norms. What you're not loyal to, and what that provision does not say, is an individual, a politician. And I think that Trump did actually a very good job of expressing his value that he wanted shared. It just was a value that was anathema to governance, which is personal loyalty to him. And that is not what a republic stands for. And it's not what the ethics rules call them for. And I think when you view it in that lens, the resistance, so to speak, is actually expected and required and good. As opposed to policy resistance. The voters should decide whether we have an administration that is pro-environment or pro, certain business interest, or is pro-immigration or anti-immigration. That's for the people to decide. That's a policy issue, and as long as it doesn't veer into the illegal, which it may well have in that one ICE case, they have an obligation to carry out the people's will by following the rules of the administration. What they don't, however, have a duty to do, and they have a duty to resist doing, is acts of an administration that attack the republic itself, the container that's supposed to hold all these policies in it. And I'll give you an example where somebody failed to do that. This month, Judge Amy Berman Jackson issued a decision saying that career lawyers in the Department of Justice had been misleading her with affidavits that falsely characterized a document that somebody was trying to get in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. And she called them to task in an absolutely blistering opinion. And the memo they were trying to conceal was one that revealed Bill Barr's lies about the Mueller report. And so they not only were fighting to conceal that, which might have been a legitimate thing, but they were fighting to conceal it with more lies. And that is a case where they should have resisted and instead carried into this administration their goal of protecting their institution from accountability for having been complicit in a propaganda effort, frankly. And so with that lens, that the type of resistance that is good is resistance in the name of democracy. A strong civil service is a threat to corrupt officials. And that's why, starting with the Pendleton Act in 1883, we began to move away from the spoils system into the merit system. And the Pendleton Act was a down payment. It only made about 15% of the career civil service merit-based rather than political-based. And in the Trump administration, you had leaders in OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, the government's HR office, articulating, at least one of them, it was attributed to him, he was the acting head of the agency, that the Pendleton Act might be unconstitutional because the president should be able to say who works there or not. And that fundamentally shifts their loyalty, because the loyalty should be to the law and to the rule of law itself and to the Constitution. And there's actually a law in the books that validates this theory. It says, and this gets to Jennifer's idea of open resistance, it says that it's a prohibited personnel practice to fire somebody or discipline them for resisting an unlawful order. Now, the risk is on their shoulders because they have to be right that it's unlawful in order to have that protection. But if it's found unlawful, you can't discipline them for resisting that unlawful order. And right there, Congress has declared that this ethical principle of loyalty to the Constitution and the laws and democracy itself go above loyalty to political masters. And I had a whole list of ways that Trump tried to undermine the civil service, because the protections at issue are the ones that make it difficult to fire somebody. You hear people complain that, oh, it's hard to fire federal employees. The reality, though, is that those rules that make it hard to fire them are for our benefit, not theirs, at least primarily. Sure, they benefit indirectly because they get to keep their jobs. But for us, it means that we have a workforce of 2.1 million federal employees, most of whom are protected by an appeal right. They can actually appeal a firing and have an objective board review the firing and reinstate them if it wasn't legitimately for cause, as opposed to political retaliation or something else. That then also comes with responsibilities. And I think if you've ever spent time in the executive branch, you quickly learn it's the least political place you've ever been. I worked in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government. I've never seen anything like it. You don't know what your coworkers believe. You don't know what their political views are. It is not talked about, and it's culturally frowned upon as an organization. And so if they're watching this right now, many of them are probably bristling at the very use of the word resistance, because they don't see themselves as resisting. They see themselves as upholding. They are upholding the rule of law. They are following the laws and upholding their oath to support the Constitution. And they culturally, except at some places like maybe EPA or ICE and the Border Patrol, police their coworkers by really making it inappropriate to undermine things based on policy. If, for instance, you don't like that the administration is increasing or decreasing a public housing program, your job is to carry that out. And you will find that most federal employees, a vast majority of them, take pride in being objective and carrying out their assignments, as long as it's not immoral or illegal. And even if it's immoral, if it's not illegal, some of them will be happy to do it. But that's why I find this phrase, the deep state, deeply repugnant and an absolute fiction, because what Trump and his allies were really referring to is that these people would uphold the rule of law and thwart corrupt ambitions of political masters. And so that's why I view resistance to policy as very different than resistance in the name of democracy. And I think we have laws on the book that encourage resistance in the name of democracy. I will tell you one of the many examples I was going to give of how Trump actually tried to attack the civil service. They came in, and I worked with many of them when they first came in. I was in the government when they arrived, and I've never met a bunch that was less sophisticated about how government works, or even about the rule of law. They did not know what they were doing, and they were inept. And that's a big part of why so many positions were left vacant. But as always happens, they got better over 4 years, and they brought in some better people in some areas. And one of the areas they got better at was understanding the civil service protections. And from the start, they viewed this imaginary deep state as the great threat. Well, there is no deep state, but it was a great threat, because they wanted to violate laws and norms and push us towards authoritarianism. And this body was rooted like weeds, focused not for the most part on politics, but on upholding the rule of law and the oath that they took. And they couldn't be fired easily. Trump did manage to push a few out, but wasn't able to fire them. But at the very end, I think, give or take a few days, October 22nd, Trump issued an executive order that would have allowed him to move any number of federal employees into a category that stripped them of all appeal rights and basically took us back to the corrupt era of the spoil system. And it took them 4 years to figure this out. The next administration that comes in with similar ambitions will pick up where they left off, and it won't take them 4 years. And if Congress doesn't reform the laws to close the loophole that made this possible, America's going to lose its last line of defense, that after Congress fails and the FBI fails and inspectors general fail, you have the civil service, and you won't have that then. Ironically, this was a case where civil servants did slow walk the implementation because he was a lame duck and failed to implement it before January 20th. And I have no doubt that that was on purpose. I also have no doubt that it was in the name of democracy and the rule of law, because I still think that that executive order would have failed a legal challenge. The problem is nobody would have had standing to fight it until they actually got fired. And these folks, I think, made a determination that it was illegal and were seeking to chase down the research to be able to show it was illegal and ran out the clock in the process. So again, I go back to the idea that a strong civil service, and we need these rules that exist to protect them for our sake, not theirs, is a threat to corrupt leaders. And resistance in the name of the rule of law or democracy is very different than resistance in the name of policy views.
Thank you, Walt. This is terrific. The questions are piling up, so I'm inclined to go right to them. And I should have said at the top, Sadia mentioned that this is the first of two events, and both of them are co-sponsored with the Democracy Fund and for the Chicago Center on Democracy, which Sue Stokes runs here at the University of Chicago. And in the next event, what we're going to try to do is look at what's happening abroad, at precisely these kind of moments of contestation between a populist and a bureaucracy. And the first question that we have is actually from Sue. So I want to read it and put it to you all. And it concerns how exceptional Trump is in some ways. So as she puts it, she says, around the world, we see some populists attacking their bureaucratic states and replacing it with their loyalists in order to achieve their policy or ideological goals. Other populists are more interested in gutting the administrative state simply as a power grab. Under Trump, did we just see the power grab strategy, or was it a mix of the two? And how would you describe other recent US administrations in these terms? Is Trump kind of bureaucratic politics as usual, or is there something exceptional happening here? And well, you went first in, so you were last to line up, but you get the first question.
So I think Trump was exceptional in the degree, not necessarily in the nature. I have a view that every presidential administration in recent times has had an authoritarian strain. Some of them move in that direction at 6 miles an hour, and some of them move in that direction at 140 miles an hour. But there is always a push for the executive branch to have more prerogatives and more power. And to some extent, that's what the founders planned. They wanted tension. The problem is the tension has failed, and it's a one-sided fight against pretty much a hapless opponent in another branch. But some of you are way more expert on that, so I'll defer to you on that. But so I think he was unique in that way. I also think he was unique in the sense that this wasn't driven by ideology. This was just pure corruption. This was for his own benefit. And there were individuals within his administration who had their own ambitions. It was not Trump who spearheaded these efforts to undo the so-called deep state. It was experts that they brought in and some policy people and ideologues who truly believed in that. But I think what was unique in that respect was also its downfall. It was the utter chaos. There was no organizing, driving force. And that also made them easier to resist in some ways, if we want to keep using that word, even though I think the people doing it would object, because they were so clueless and so inept that a lot of their efforts, including even policy efforts like rolling back environmental rules, were done incorrectly and were easier to challenge. I think you could imagine a future administration that is much more disciplined, much more skilled, and much more focused. And I think they would move us in that authoritarian direction much faster and frankly be harder to resist.
Jennifer.
Just to answer the question in a slightly different angle, but also amplifying some of Walt's points. I mean, I do think what is striking about the Trump administration relative to, let's say, the Reagan administration's efforts also to dismantle the administrative state in different ways is, just as Walt was alluding to, and this is David's point too, it was just the incompetence at the top. And just one fact I want to throw out is I think the Reagan administration, by contrast, had much more competent political appointees that could still, write the rules and, write other kind of agency decisions that could withstand judicial review. Like, they were talented lawyers. Whereas the Trump administration, the fact I want to throw out is something, some studies have suggested that the Trump administration lost more than 90% of the cases when the Administrative State was trying to deregulate, usually on arbitrary and capricious review. I mean, that's astounding, and it just speaks to the extent to which both the political appointees were incompetent, or they didn't exist because the positions were vacant. And despite the framing of the question where the hollowing out of the Administrative State as a power grab, in Trump's case it was the opposite, because he needed the civil servants to help him. And if the civil servants could be loyal, I mean, this is what happens in many administrations. Civil servants will turn around and help the new president with different policy choices write rules that will withstand judicial review. And I think that was also very distinct about the Trump administration.
Thank you. So, listening to all of you, a concern I had to do with the enforceability of different kinds of actions or practices. And in the enforceability of those actions or practices in the face of one, to borrow from your distinction, Walt, one who is attacking democracy itself. What are we to do when somebody who is intent upon rolling back the rule of law, how can we ensure that things like, Dave, you drew our attention to the value of drawing one's attention to a shared set of values and amplifying them and reaffirming them? What do we do when somebody refuses to do that? And we have a question here that's directed to the topic that you raised, Rudy, which has to do with vetting candidates for Senate approval. One, if we were to put in statutory, the question is, if we were to put in sort of a more robust set of statutory qualifications that particular appointees are meant to meet, how are we to think about their constitutionality first, but then moreover, their enforceability? What's to keep, the next Trump from coming forward and saying, that's all fine and good, but I'm going to have the people I want, damn it, and I'm going to press forward?
I mean, these are excellent questions, and it gets to something I was going to speak about in terms of inspectors general, right? Because for inspectors general, which for those who may not know, they're essentially supposed to serve as the independent, nonpartisan watchdogs within agencies that are to ensure the efficient and effective administration of government programs and taxpayer dollars. And the statute, the Inspector General Act, which was created following the Nixon era scandals, actually lays out some specific qualifications that inspectors general are supposed to have. They're supposed to be experienced in a variety of topics, accounting, auditing. They're supposed to be appointed without regard to partisan affiliation. And there's supposed to be some mechanism that protects a president from arbitrarily removing an inspector general based on their own liking without, and the mechanism basically requires notice to Congress and 30 days prior to removal. And what we have seen, and I think the most prominent example of this is when President Trump removed Michael Atkinson from his post as the IG for the intelligence community, that there really is not a significant, that statute as written is an insufficient check on ensuring that inspectors general are truly independent and protecting against their arbitrary removal. And what's worse is that when they are removed, the Vacancies Act, which David referenced, could then be utilized to install one of your own allies, even if it's just temporarily, for an extended period of time to disrupt active inspector general investigations. So I do think that there's a way that these statutes can be structured to be more effective, but it still requires a Congress that's willing to hold a president's feet to the fire. And I think that that's one of the disappointing things that we saw during the Trump administration. And as I reflect back on the work that I did outside of government, trying to ensure there was some accountability for the kinds of abuses we're talking about, I never anticipated the amount of dereliction of responsibility by the Republican Party and their willingness to depart from these long-held norms and democratic guardrails that had been supported by huge bipartisan majorities, so much so that we never even considered that they would need to be supported by legislation. That is something that requires a lot more thought. I do want to say, stepping back away from this particular question, I know I didn't speak to the constitutionality of it. I do think they're constitutional. I'll let other people speak to that if they wish. But I think I wanted to pick up on something that Jennifer and Walt mentioned. I think part of the challenge with the Trump administration was not just the incompetence of some of the people they appointed and the vacancies they left behind, but at least at the beginning of the administration, it was simply just a disinterest in the complexities of the executive branch and how government operates. And I think because of that disinterest, that it led to some of these just clumsy and irresponsible actions that were able to be challenged effectively in court. And I think that we saw that from the get-go. Walt had a front row seat to this because he was working with the transition team. But when the Trump team wasn't even interested in when we were in the Obama administration moving out, when they weren't even interested in taking us up on offers for transition briefings and exit interviews. I mean, for those who like Michael Lewis, is a phenomenal author, wrote an incredible book on this called The Fifth Risk. Another one is just being released on the U.S. government's failed and inadequate response to the pandemic. He goes into detail about the ways in which the Trump administration really derelicted what was a dereliction of duty and responsibility, and it endangered the United States and really all of us in so many different ways. One of the shocking things to me on the way out was the way they just really ignored our suggestions when it came to people who should continue to serve in critical national security positions. I mean, it was, I think, January 19th when I received an email from Trump's transition team asking for the administrator for the Nuclear National Security Administration to stay in their position, giving me the impression that they had already received agreement from General Klotz, who was occupying that position. And for all I knew, he was no longer even in the job. And we had sent lists to the Trump team months earlier about who they should keep in their job. So I think that part of it was just this pure ignorance and disinterest in how the federal government should operate.
Mm-hmm. So, in your comments, we were lingering on the stakes associated with an assault on the bureaucracy as they relate to democracy and the health of democracy. But there also is, your comments here really point us back towards some concerns that both Rachel and David raised at the front end, and I want to bring them back in thinking about just the well-functioning of bureaucracy, its ability to fulfill its basic obligations and duties. And we have a question from Ian Turner, who is a terrific scholar who writes a lot on the bureaucracy at Yale. And he writes in, he says, related to Jennifer's extraordinary examples of disobedience, I wonder what the panelists think about the potential lasting effects of corrosion of positive incentives, public service motivation, capacity maintenance, the development within agencies that were targeted by the administration. I've been thinking a lot about whether or not there would be longer term ramifications on these kinds of dimensions. So even before we get to the health of democracy, how do we think about the long-term ramifications of these kinds of assaults on bureaucracy, on the bureaucracy's ability to fulfill their basic functions? And Jennifer, do you want to take the first stab at that? And then we'll come over to you, Dave.
Sure. Maybe the stab that I'll take will also be a chance to just kind of respond a little bit to Walter's comments about his more optimistic view of, I suppose, the kind of longer term impacts of the kinds of resistance that we saw in the Trump administration. And I'm just make two kind of points to throw out there for a broader discussion possibly. So one is just to explode possibly what I take to be kind of a false distinction sometimes between law and policy. Look, a lot of laws are ambiguous, right? Like, does, air pollution mean greenhouse gases, right? Does stationary source mean a smokestack or a facility? And, when laws are ambiguous, right, there are policy considerations that have to be done, that have to be policy trade-offs that have to be made. And so the first point that I just want to make is, given that the line between law and policy is actually very fluid, I think that this is something that the public certainly doesn't appreciate. And one person's clear violation of the rule of law, especially in our hyperpolarized environment, is another person's just policy choice, policy resistance. And so I worry, to Ian's question about the delegitimation of the administrative state to the public, because of, and this is the second point, the openness of the resistance. That is to say, again, that this open dissent to a good deal of the population will just seem like policy resistance. It will not seem to them to be violations of the rule of law. Last thing I'll say is, I do think that debate is healthy about the line between law and policy, but I think it's healthiest internal, when it's done, in the meetings and, in the back and forth between political appointees and civil servants. And so I guess that's why I think that this kind of dissent is ultimately destructive. And so, to Ian's question, I hope that the legitimation of the bureaucracy to the public is something that will be restored, but I think it'll be a long time before that happens, given the polarization that exists.
Rachel, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm going to come to you in just 1 second. I saw, Rachel, you nodding, and you have served in the executive branch. You've seen these things play out firsthand. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the bureaucratic reputation, and I know Dave has written about this a lot, it's been on a long-term downtrend. Bureaucracy is a 4-letter word in the United States. And so how do we restore the idea that a 22-year-old graduating from college wants to come get one of these jobs? And that people trust the decisions that the CDC makes. I mean, we have so many reforms that need to get made at this moment in time. And the president doesn't have a lot of incentive. Congress doesn't have a lot of incentive. So what prospects for restoring this without reform do we have? I think we probably need some sort of major commission to really take stock about how we institutionalize these things. So Walt mentioned the Schedule F executive order, which really had me awake at night. And that was the one that would have allowed more political appointees, or convert some civil servants to political appointee-like positions, and sort of more of a return to the patronage era of bureaucracy. So we need to enact laws that prevent that kind of influence in the bureaucracy, that restore credibility. And I don't know what kind of, in a highly partisan polarized world, the only prospects I see for that is some sort of commission that makes recommendations that by some miracle, President Biden or some future president actually takes seriously.
If I could just add to what Rachel said, I absolutely agree that these reforms are necessary. And I would just add that whistleblower reforms will actually also have the effect of reducing leaking. If people can safely come forward through appropriate channels and disclose wrongdoing, they will have much less incentive to break the law, or even if it's not strictly illegal, go public with something. And so when I say that I see a difference, keep in mind that I'm not talking about a difference where I think anything goes if it's in the name of democracy. I just think that the laws that protect employees from being fired, the laws that ensure that they can blow the whistle, these are the things that strengthen democracy, not just protect people's jobs.
Thanks, Walt. Dave, you get the final word. So what's at stake here? And is the damage done? To the extent the damage has been done, is it going to persist?
It's hard to top these last two comments, so I won't say too much more, other than we need good people there doing things that extend beyond their job descriptions, and young people, and it is the time for a serious rethinking about how to establish a healthy administrative state moving forward. So I'll just amplify that comment.
Terrific. Rachel, Dave, Jennifer, Rudy, Walt, thank you for coming together and spending an hour and 15 minutes with us, sharing your expertise, your thoughts. And thank you to the audience for joining in on this important conversation, to the Chicago Center on Democracy, to the Democracy Fund, and the Center for Effective Government and their various teams who made all of this possible. This is really terrific. Thank you all.